So about 7 years ago, I was on the Anthony Bourdain show, and I wrote an article about being a black adult onset hunter. And that article got the attention of MeatEater Network. My name came up.
Jonathan Hall. Jonathan says that in his article. And I know that Jonathan Hall in his writing is the thing. Jonathan Hall, who...
I was talking to a writer one time who wrote a piece about being black and being afraid to be on public lands. And I called him to ask him what he meant.
You finna get some bleeps.
Hey folks, welcome back to Out There JCH. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jonathan. I'm a wildlife ecology professor sharing my journey and insights with wild food and sustainable relations. Last week, I posted part 1 of my critique of MeatEater and their conversation around race and hunting. I'm going to conclude my critique and then come back at the end and talk about part 3 of this miniseries. If you haven't watched part 1, make sure you go back and do that. All right, let's not waste any time.
Wanted to have an open casket so that the world could see, what had happened to her boy, the brutality of it. I was shocked.
Okay, so this is now the MeatEater podcast with Steven Ranella, and the person who's talking is Rumat, the founder of Outdoor Afro, and she's talking about a conversation that she had with her father about Emmett Till's murder, which was a turning point in the fight for civil rights for black folks in the United States of America. If you don't know about Emmett Till, go look up Emmett Till's story. And so this line of the conversation is going to lead into Steven Ranella recalling his conversation with me. And so the subject is like violence against black people by white people for no other reason than that person who has the violence visited upon them is black. Hey folks, I just wanted to take a break and let you know that one of the best ways to get the most out of the content on this channel is to subscribe to my newsletter. Every Sunday, I give you more depth and insight into the topics I cover on Out There JCH, including thoughts and perspectives that I don't really share on this platform. The newsletter is free to sign up, and as an incentive to becoming a subscriber, I'm offering a free wild food resource guide that will help make you a more capable harvester and home cook. Just click the link in the description to sign up. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Right? And so this episode aired in July of 2020. So we're about 10 months removed from the conversation that Ben has with Dr. Finney, and now the main person of MeatEater, Steven Ranella, is talking to another prominent African-American who's working in the field of race in the outdoors about this issue of race. And the title of this episode is A Difficult Conversation. I find Rue's words here just absolutely fantastic in the same way that Dr. Finney's words were really important.
And I remember going right to my dad after seeing that, and I had asked him, because he lived in Texas all of his life, and I'd asked him, I was like, do you know of anyone who's been lynched? And he just leveled with me and he said, all the time. And that helped me to get present at a really young age, that there's been a disruption of a feeling of safety and belonging that exists in generational memory. If your dad or if your grandfather can tell you firsthand stories and accounts of those types of things happening, and who, still hold those fears of something happening to you. Outdoor Afro sent, folks on all kinds of different adventures, whether it be Mount Whitney or Kilimanjaro. And I can't tell you that when those expeditioners go out, just the real fear and concern that those families have for the safety of those folks. And I think that that's something that, we some groups can take for granted, that you can go out and you can, feel okay. And you might worry about wildlife to some extent if you're not experienced with it. But for Black people, it's about being worried about other humans.
I was talking to a writer one time who wrote a piece about being black and being afraid to be on public lands. Mm-hmm. And I called him.
Bro, you can mention my name.
To ask him what he meant, right? I wanted him to back it up, like what he meant when he said that. I could see that someone would say, let's say someone said, I have concerns of being out in the woods on public land and getting shot by a hunter. Mm-hmm. And we could go and look in the news
and see,
and we could find like, oh, here's a case where a guy, what happened a year or two ago, someone like mistook a woman walking her dog for a deer and shot her. Mm-hmm. So we could go find instances that would substantiate or not. Or someone says, I'm afraid of grizzlies, and be like, okay, let's dig into this, right? Is being afraid of grizzlies warranted or not? Now, they might still be like, yeah, I'm still, but I get it. Statistically, it won't happen, but I'm still afraid of them.
Yeah.
But I wanted to understand, like, the fear of public lands.
Yeah, I don't know if it's public lands. I think it's just a fear of just being out, in places where, there's not anybody, places where you don't feel defensible.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Rue. I really don't understand how this is difficult for anybody to understand. George Floyd was murdered 2 months before this podcast aired. I don't understand how somebody can be conscious of the many ways that black people are killed. But I don't think it's reasonable for a black person to expect that in a hunting situation, they'd run into danger. The only way that you can explain this like chain of logic is willful ignorance. And I don't think any of these guys are like maliciously racist. I just think that they are afraid of taking what all these black people are saying, that racism continues to exist and the thing that's doing the racism is whiteness, taking that idea to its logical conclusion as to what it means for them in their profession. And all the things that they would have to take on mentally, emotionally, to understand this landscape. They really don't want to do that. And so that's why you see all of these mental gymnastics of them denying things that are very straightforward. I feel nervous about being in isolated spaces where I'm probably the only person who looks like me, with a bunch of people who have been socialized to take power and take life for any manner of reason, and that they continue to get away with taking the lives of black people for any reason.
And when it comes, let's be clear here. When it comes to incidents of racism, rarely do you ever get the proof.
Yeah.
And rarely do you need it for it to be validated.
But in the case of like violent, like physical safety and violent crime,
yeah,
would we not know these?
So here's how we address it.
What do you mean, wouldn't we know? If there hadn't been somebody recording Walter Scott running away from the police and the police officer shooting him in the back, we wouldn't have known. Ida B. Wells had to go around and document lynchings because nobody else was doing it. Wouldn't we know? That is unbelievable naivete. Wouldn't we know?
In our organization, because it comes up pretty frequently for us, and we're not, out
fear.
Yeah, we're not, out here, publicizing our stats and things like that, and we don't need to, for it to be valid, right? If someone, tells me that they are confronted by a group of people who want to know why you're there, what are you doing?
Yeah.
How long are you going to be here? That's not really friendly and inviting.
No, not at all.
Right. And so those are the kinds of things that, are really tough to help people understand, that just the unwelcoming piece can be enough of a barrier for people who, are already coming in with a lot of historical narrative, a lot of things that, we've grown up knowing about. And so when you go out to a place and people are confronting your very reason for being in a place, that alone is problematic. And those are the kinds of barriers that we have to push through in our work. I've personally experienced it, and I've got tremendous nature swagger. I go out and I don't feel ever that I don't belong in public lands. But I've absolutely encountered people who ask me a few too many questions to prove that, I belong here and that I'm not a trespasser here. And I think it gets back to this idea that, I think this is kind of a traditional mindset, that public lands belong to certain people, and that even humans as a whole, don't belong in true wilderness. And I think there's just a bigger conversation we have to have, around just this idea of humans belonging in nature and how we can exist with nature, generally speaking, But I think that when it comes to communities that have not, one, felt historically and have known historically that they're not welcomed, and that bad things have happened in the wood, and there are statistics about that. I mean, from I believe 1877 through 1950, there were 4,400 instances of people being lynched, men, women, children, shot, maimed, and these are all, and this is just what we know, you know. So not everything gets reported. Not everything, makes the front pages, but it doesn't make it less true. And so again, this is why the work I do feels so relevant, because I want people to be able to come out in groups. Oftentimes people don't want to traipse out into the outdoors by themselves. They want to go out in groups of people to help them not only learn, but importantly, to feel safe. And if people can continue to go out again and again, which they do, I very much see like the work we do is like, almost training wheels, if you will, for people to get out and go, wow, okay, I know where to go. I know how to get there. I know where to park. I know I'll be okay there.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of work to do around welcoming.
If somebody were listening to this, and especially if it were a Black person who was listening to this episode and said, "Oh, I wonder who Steve is talking about," right? I can see, Rue, all of her stuff is linked on the show. I can follow her. I can figure out where she is and who she is. But this writer who talks about feeling uncomfortable on public land, that's how I feel, right? There could be Black people listening to this or other people of color listening to this show, this episode, and want to know who the fuck he's talking about. But it's, again, it's just upsetting how unprofessional they're handling this conversation. Like, why would you not mention my name so that people can find the article? Well, it's because you don't think it's legitimate. That's why, right? If you respect the person, and if you respect what they're saying, and if you find it interesting and something that other people should be aware of, then you make sure that other people know where they can find the person who's talking about something that you find interesting. I don't know. I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted, and I'm getting like more and more frustrated and angry as I listen to these conversations. But I'm gonna try to sum up what I think should be a takeaway from this. I think, the biggest thing is the fact that the rhetoric of concern that the MeatEater folks have said that they have for this issue is not at all supported by the evidence. They have had a handful of conversations about this sort of thing on their regular podcasts. They haven't come back to it. There is no indication that the murder of Peter Spencer was anything on their radar for them to talk about. And they have not continued to talk about this issue of race in the outdoors. So, one takeaway that I have from this is that when they say that they care about this issue, they don't. They want to care about it. They want maybe people in the audience to feel that they care about it. They maybe feel like they have a duty to demonstrate in some way that they care about it, but they don't actually care about this. When you care about an issue, and particularly an issue like this, and you begin to understand how important it is or how pervasive race structures our reality, then it becomes a very clear focus of what you do. And you can't look at anything that MeatEater has done to say that like one of the pillars with which their media company exists and the things that they interact with has to do with race. They dip their toes in it, much like a lot of organizations dip their toes into race and racism around this time, because it became like fashionable and popular to talk about these sorts of things.
You can't relate to that if you're white, but you can listen, try to help.
So MeatEater is no different than that. But they are lying to you when they say that like this is something that they care about. And their actions show that. So that's like the first takeaway. The second takeaway is I think it's very clear that they want to continue to have power over how they have this conversation, which again, I think is understandable because like they have a media company, and if things go sideways, and like they stand to lose something. So I understand them wanting to have some control over the conversation. But you notice how they particularly with Ben, but also with Steven, they bring my name up and they bring up what I've talked about, but they want to have a conversation with other people, other black people about this. And again, I'm not begrudging them having conversations with Dr. Finney and Rue Matt, because I think that, if you were only going to talk to two black people about the outdoors and race and racism, it should not be me. It should be them. Okay? But if you are going to bring me up, if you are going to bring my name up and talk about me and talk about my work, and if one of the people who you bring onto the show talks about me and brings up my work and names it as another sort of piece in this conversation or in this education that black people are offering, then you should have me on the show. Don't talk about me when you have an opportunity to talk with me. If I were to have this conversation, if I were to continue this conversation with the MeatEater folks, have you all examined whiteness and like what it means for you? You want to think that you are experts when you're talking to people who've thought about a subject every single day of their lives for decades. Like, it's not a constant in your life. So if I say something about race in the outdoors, about being uncomfortable in the outdoors, you need to take that seriously until you've done some semblance of the equivalent work that I have done to reach that conclusion. Don't read something that I wrote and then because it makes you feel uncomfortable say, nah, that's not really a thing, but not actually do the work that went into writing that article. All you're putting into responding to what I've written is your own feelings. You haven't looked into this history at all, really. So, like, have some humility and take what I say seriously until you have enough evidence outside of your own feelings refutes what I'm saying. But you haven't even done that work. So that's the other thing. This whole experience about listening to people talk about you, but not talk with you is really disrespectful. And the last thing I will say is the reason why we don't have progress in any sort of realm or space is around issues of race and racism is not because black people aren't doing enough stuff. It's because white people aren't doing even close to their fair share of work in dismantling whiteness and dismantling racism. Peter Spencer happened because of whiteness, and the lack of any sort of anything approaching justice happens because of whiteness. White people love to talk about, like, I'm an individual, don't judge me, da 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 da. A set of individuals with a tremendous platform could literally steer the culture of hunting in a way that makes things safer for black people. They haven't done anything close to what they could do given the power that they have. The very next episode that they chose to air after this, quote, a difficult conversation, was an episode in which Donald Trump Jr. was their guest. It feels like trolling. It feels like gaslighting. They're up to episode 543. They're signaling to the people who are conscious of this issue that it doesn't matter. And one thing that I don't think that they're considering is they're signaling to the people who are not really thinking about this that this is not important. They are telling us that, like, yeah, we'll have this conversation when it's like fashionable to have it. But afterwards, like, we're not really interested in having this conversation. Whew. Glad I got that off my chest. Now, I want to conclude this miniseries by talking about the 3 books that changed me as a hunter and wild food harvester. I think it'll be a nice way to end this pretty challenging conversation. If you're looking for more regular hunting content, be sure to check out this video on butchering a whole white-tailed deer. This series has been my most popular by far on this channel, and it's clearly something that people want to talk about. There have been over 100 comments. I've done my best to respond to as many of them as I can make time for, and I'll do the same for this video and part 3. So please weigh in and let's keep this conversation going. All right, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on